Ring of Fire. On today's show, we'll be talking with author and Ring of Fire co-host Robert F. Kennedy Jr. about the climate criminals who are pumping unprecedented amounts of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere, killing us slowly. College graduates are struggling to pay for their student loans, and both the banks and the Obama administration are pulling in billions of dollars off this struggle. We'll bring you more of those details. And Big Pharma has been using human beings as lab rats for decades, but the true horror of what's been happening only surfaced recently. We'll tell you that story. We'll have all that and more coming up. And just remember, right now you've just entered the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
We've seen some truly disgusting behavior from drug companies in the past few decades, but this next story takes Big Pharma's criminal behavior to a whole new level. For years, the industry has been using human beings as lab rats for their experiments. I have investigative journalist Rick Outzen with me now to talk about what's been happening. Rick, a startling article that Der Spiegel is reporting about East Germany, where you had the largest drug companies in the world. You had Pfizer, you had Bayer, you had Roche, you had Boehringer Ingelheim, you had all of these huge drug companies that were using East Germans as guinea pigs, 50,000, to experiment on whether their drugs would work or whether it would kill the people that they're experimenting on. Tell us about the story, lay it out for us.
Well, you know, it's like a Robert Ludlum novel. You know, an Iron Curtain country sells its sick citizens, prostitutes itself to become a huge laboratory for Western drug manufacturers. This happened in the 80s. They actually institutionalized this, Mike, where the government got involved. They had as many as 40 manufacturers a week, Pfizer, Bayer, Roche, all the big companies coming to them to run their experiments, test their drugs in over 50 hospitals in East Germany. 4 people died. Several people were given placebos with terrible diseases, not knowing that they weren't really being taken care of.
Well, about the number of deaths, right now they don't know the number of deaths because they haven't even done a metric look back to figure out what actually this is all about. But one thing we do know that it's about these huge drug companies doing what they do all over the world. This isn't just a story about East Germany, although the story's emerging about East Germany. We see drug companies doing this in Uganda, Guatemala, all over the world, India, China, where there are emerging governments that simply don't regulate this. And so what ends up happening is they pay off the government. They basically use these people as human guinea pigs. How much money would a company make here?
Well, you know, they'll make $14 billion is the latest number that I've seen in the stories that I've read. But, you know, each one of these tests were 800 Dutch marks over in East Germany. They were funding, and I'm sure it's the same way in the third world countries, is, Mike, they use this drug money, they get new equipment, they actually are supporting the healthcare system from the drug manufacturers at the cost of human life. And what's happening is the pressure on these doctors in these countries, East Germany's just one of them, where to keep these tests going, they can't complain. They have to get this money. There's so much pressure on them to raise money for their economies, for their healthcare system, that you know, and the big pharma takes advantage of it.
Rick, it's as if Western media simply ignores all this. You know, here we know the stories. We've seen the story play out itself, again, in places like Uganda, Guatemala, India, China. We know that they are basically experimenting with the citizens. And that, you know, they aren't U.S. citizens, but we see the same thing happening to some degree even in the U.S., stories that aren't talked about. What's the reaction of the drug industry about all this?
Oh, they will tell you that they're following their protocols, that all these tests are being done properly, that they have informed consent from the people that are participating in the studies. And Mike, we know that's not true. You know, they give a mother in Uganda $50 to do a test, and she signs a paper. She has no idea what she's signing. Same thing happens in Southeast Asia. It's happening, you know, in East Germany. They were testing alcoholics, people with psychotic diseases who had no way to give informed consent. It's just a sham, but that's what they're hiding behind, that they're saying they're following all their protocols.
Well, when they've done look backs, when companies have been caught doing this in emerging third world countries, they've gone back and it's not just anecdotal. I mean, the numbers are overwhelming. They would go back and talk to the parents, for example,
Right.
where the children were being tested. And they would ask the parents, well, what did you think was happening? And the parent would say, well, my child was being treated and my child was their health was going to get better because they were being treated with this medication. And they also found out that there was such a huge impact of the way that the doctor is regarded and the way that the corporation is regarded in these third world countries, that they assume there's no way on earth that these people would possibly do us harm. Just the opposite has played itself out in so many stories around the world, hasn't it, Rick?
It has. These people are being given placebos when they have diabetes. They have so many other problems, health issues, and they can't figure out why they're not getting well. Well, they were given a placebo. They're not given the medicine that works. But it goes even further. A lot of this testing is being done now on children and infants. In the story out of East Germany, Der Spiegel, their story talks about preemies being given performance-enhancing drugs as test guinea pigs. 1 and 2 pound babies being used for these, what I consider horrendous experiments with no consent from the parents, no one even knowing that this is going on. But it's happening all over the world, and it's now involving children, and that to me is just horrific.
Well, what's happened is the U.S. government has been convinced by the drug industry that there ought to be some special laws, some carve-out laws. They call it the pediatric exclusivity procedure, and that is where they're allowed really to push the limits of ethics. This exclusivity says, well, gee, if this is going to involve children, we're going to allow you a lot of leeway when we review the clinicals. When you go to a third world country like Uganda, for example, or you go to India and you perform these tests, we're going to give you a lot of leeway, and we're going to accept the fact that you've actually tested on children because that special carve out, it's going to help our children here in the United States. So we don't really limit you in what you're able to do. Tell us a little bit about that, how that has evolved.
Well, the law came out in the 1990s. It has been one that, you're right, in the United States, you're not allowed to test drugs on children. It has to be done on adults, and the protocols are set much stricter than they were, let's say in the 60s, 40s, and 50s. But for them, this is a huge moneymaker. I mean, they can go to India, they can go to Africa, and they can test these drugs on these children. The mothers are not being told that there's any harmful effects or possible bad things that can happen to their children. They're thinking, like you said earlier, they're trusting their doctors. They're given $50. They sign a form that they don't understand. And the impact, we're still trying to figure out the impact of what it's done to these emerging nations as far as their children.
Well, don't we always see the scare card? Don't we always see the fear card that's played out by these companies? The part of the fear is, if we don't do this way, we're not going to be able to solve the problem. We have to do it by pushing the limits on ethics, pushing the limits on morality, or we're not going to be able to get a solution. Don't we hear that again and again?
We do, and it plays into the conservative mindset that our children are more important than someone else's children. That the American kids need this, while poor Asians or Africans, they don't have to have the same quality of care. They're our guinea pigs so that we can be healthier, our kids can be better. It's so evil in its intent.
Rick, to put this in perspective, what we saw, starting with the studies, with the new found information coming out of East Germany, now we're finding that these companies, as you pointed out, were paid about $1 million per study. They go over there, they pay the government $1 million. The government then says, we're going to take that money and spread it out however we want. Now, obviously, part of it is graft. Who's going to pocket money? What campaign is this going to go into? how are we going to make a decision on where the money goes? The pharmaceutical company doesn't really care. They go in, they pay the $1 million. There were 600 times, as far as we know today, 600 times these drug companies went into East Germany and performed these human guinea pig experiments with their drugs without any regulatory oversight. And I thought it was interesting that the place they found this information was in the Secret Service files called Stasi of East Germany. I mean, one of those most brutal Secret Service agencies in the world, this is where they found this information.
Well, it was, what they did is they institutionalized this, Mike. This became a government agency. They set up they rented a dilapidated apartment in an East Berlin neighborhood. They had all these cars from the West Germany coming to this little apartment, signing these deals with 50 hospitals, some of the most internationally known hospitals in East Germany. And they were conducting these tests. The money was being split. Is the other thing I thought was interesting, Der Spiegel reported, is there actually was a fight as who would get the money. Would it go into health care? Would it go into the general coffers of the government? And they ended up splitting it 50-50. But just the pressure on these doctors to do these experiments because there was money for, to fund the government. And this wasn't private under the table things. This was done openly with the government's help.
Yeah, well, as we've seen, as I say, we see that in third world countries all the time, where they don't make any, there's no barriers here. I mean, they simply go in with the right amount of money, and the government allows them to do what they want to do. In about a minute, Rick, you are an investigative journalist and have been for your adult life. Aren't you glad that an organization like Der Spiegel is looking at this rather than a U.S. media organization?
Totally, Mike. Here the drug companies would be trying to cut advertising. They would be threatening all the reporters, threatening the publishers, and maybe this story might not ever get published in the United States. Der Spiegel stepped up. They released this article last week. Government's already stepping in. Their files they're trying to protect. We're hearing that the old government files are being hauled out of warehouse and destroyed. They're trying to stop that. But here in this country, it would be sad. I'm not sure the story would be told.
Well, my call is, Rick, that it wouldn't be told, that corporate media would make this story die. Rick Outzen, as usual, great information. This is a story that it really has just started from a standpoint of looking at how ugly it is. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Mike.
Just ahead, we'll take a look at how big banks and the federal government are getting rich off the backs of struggling college students. We'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Student loan interest rates are set to almost double in the next months, and college graduates are already unable to pay back the obscene debt that they've gathered simply by going to college. Joining me now to discuss the problem is David Pakman, host of The David Pakman Show. So David, the U.S. government, wow, this is like a cash cow, $51 billion that they're making off of student loans. And of course, the part of the story that's not told is how much Wall Street's making right along with them on this. This is a story that is just now surfacing, but it's been out there for 2 years.
Yeah, it has, and I am no longer surprised when I hear stories like this. I just recently did a great story on my show about how we actually have big banks making money off of the detention of illegal immigrants through their ownership stakes in some of the big prison corporations. Right. So when you start to,
I saw this story is good.
When you start to connect a lot of those dots, this isn't really surprising. But what it does show is that it makes us really ask the question, do we need to be making money off of something which is presumably an investment in the future of the country in areas of education where we're falling quickly behind other countries? I think the answer is no.
What do the numbers look like on this, David? I mean, when we talk about high interest, I mean, we've got, at some point, we remember they used to, I suppose, pay 3% interest on a loan, and now it's 6, 7, and has potential to go higher, right?
Right, 6.8% in many cases. I actually I was lucky enough not to have student loans from undergraduate work, but I just finished graduate school about 3 years ago. I did an MBA, and I now am paying 6.8% on the loans that I'm trying to pay off as fast as possible. And of course, there's interest in seeing that go higher. Fortunately, Elizabeth Warren wants to reduce that rate. I think it makes sense. People like Robert Applebaum from Forgive Student Loan Debt think that it makes sense, and it just obviously does.
Is this, what you see happening, is it consistent with what we heard from Obama when he was out on the stump speech circuit? I mean, didn't we hear, I feel your pain? I mean, really?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, we did hear that, broadly speaking, people should be able to afford education. Ideally, those with less means aren't disproportionately less able to afford education. And when we talk about is it liberal or is it conservative to handle student loan policy in one way or another, there is no greater economic stimulator than having more people have higher levels of education. And when we talk about, the effect of food stamp spending by the government versus spending on tax cuts for the rich, or giving up revenue for tax cuts for the rich, we know that one has a much higher economic multiplier. This goes beyond the numbers. This is just common sense. The multiplier, the social multiplier of more education is huge.
Well, I mean, to put this in perspective, I saw these numbers. Exxon Corporation made, they reported almost a $50 billion net income last year. And here we're talking about the government making $51 billion just off of students. I mean, Apple made $41.7 billion, but here you have the government making $51 billion. Isn't part of the story that's not told is how Wall Street is actually benefiting from this too. I mean, we see Wall Street loving this because ultimately they're the ones, at this point, they're actually packaging CDOs and swaps and synthetics all based on these student loans, just like we saw with the mortgage industry.
Yeah, this is really one of those cases where we see kind of a public line from Wall Street on regulation,
right,
and on the government doing things that end up being, quote, profitable. And then at the same time, we see that they have so many shared interests in much the same way. And it really makes us question what I always question, which is kind of the connection and role of money in politics. And even though we have these ideas of, conservatives want small government and not much connection between government and private industry, and liberals supposedly want a government that is very involved in business. This kind of breaks it all down, and we see that the interests are very, very similar, no matter whether you talk about Democrats or Republicans.
Right. I don't think there's any party lines here, because I think, first of all, Obama could stop this. He could be more aggressive and do something about it. But look, you've got the problem is it has bigger economic ramifications. If you have, I think it's $1 trillion in student debts. It exceeds household debts. It exceeds all other types of debts. And when we look at this debt and we see Wall Street saying, here's an opportunity to take this debt and make more money of it, don't we see the next thing that's getting ready to happen? It looks like a bubble to me if you really watch the numbers here and you watch the way everybody's moving around.
Yeah, the bubble is the bubble could pop in a number of different spots. I mean, when we think about predatory mortgage lending and we say, a lot of these terms and the way these mortgages were presented, the buyers didn't really understand what they were getting into. Now, in many cases, those buyers were 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years old. Here, student loans are mostly going to 17 and 18-year-olds. Many of these students are 17 when they decide which college they're going to go to and whether they need loans for that. If the government decided, if regulators and all of the panels decided that 34-year-old couples didn't really understand what they were getting into and that it was a predatory loan, a 17-year-old, how can we argue that if the 34-year-old didn't understand their mortgage, 17-year-olds know what they're getting into? You just can't.
Well, what's really interesting about this is like a no-risk kind of deal, both for Wall Street and the government, because the student can come out of education, out of 4 years of college, they owe $24,000, okay? They don't have the ability to buy a home. They don't have the ability to do anything that really adds to the economy from the standpoint of moving ahead with their lives, because they have this loan hanging over their head. The other thing, the other part of it is there's no right for that student to declare bankruptcy, is there, David? I mean, it's a great protection for the lender. What lender could possibly want a better deal?
No, it's a lot of people don't know that student loans are one of the only types of debt that does not clear if the individual declares bankruptcy. It continues to follow you. And as you know, you declare bankruptcy, 7 years, your credit is absolutely destroyed. It's hard to even get a secured credit card at that point. But your student loans, the loans that you took on presumably because you wanted to contribute more to society, you wanted to educate yourself, you wanted to get a job, you knew maybe that in China and India we have so many new engineers that are coming to the US, and you wanted to work in those fields, you still have that debt. And it really is, it's really a sad commentary, especially on the future for the US.
David, I was talking to a friend of mine, European, that came through the college systems over in Europe. And, you know, his response to this was he doesn't have a lot of sympathy for the students over here, because he says, you know what, when we were being abused in France or Spain or Italy, we went to the streets. I mean, if you think about some of the biggest demonstrations that took place in Europe, France is a great example. I remember getting off the plane in France, huge demonstration. They had to close Paris down because the students were so damn angry about what was happening to them. And what was happening to them is nothing compared to what's happening to the U.S. student. So I think you have an attitude among a lot of people, well, you know, it's hard for me to have sympathy because they won't go to the streets. They won't become a little more rebellious about this whole thing. What is your take on that?
I don't disagree with that. In other words, there should be way more action about these issues, people demonstrating. The thing is, it's not just that casually there aren't people in the streets. There's a deliberate junction of big corporations and media reporting on student loans when they even do, which is even a stretch, in a way that doesn't even really suggest to the students that there's an opportunity to do something, to organize about it, that this could change. That's not to defend the students for not organizing. I still think they should be, but we have to think about how there's this additional hill to climb, which is that the corporate media are reporting on this story in a way that is not really meant to inspire anybody to go out and take any action, much the same way that the corporate media stood by when President Obama expanded the Patriot Act. Wait a second, that ended up affecting corporate media. Now we see, you know, the AP situation. This is being deliberately reported on in a way that does not inspire anybody to get into the street. So people need to figure out other ways to get the information.
Well, one thing we used to see, David, and we still see it in Europe, is they're all student unions. I mean, they're organized, and they are a political movement to be reckoned with in every election. They're hugely organized campus to campus. We don't have anything that I can recognize as being that powerful in the U.S. Maybe I'm missing something.
No, I mean, when you look at a lot of the student unions I've either been involved in directly or just friends have been involved in or people I've interviewed, they focus mostly on kind of internal school issues. So when I was an undergrad at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, the student union joined forces with the graduate students to make sure that they would continue getting low-cost health care while they're carrying out their school. Very important stuff, but also very different than really joining forces with student unions across Massachusetts, for example, to protest what are, by many measures, predatory student loan practices. I'm not looking to fault them for that. There's just so many different issues around education that students need to be focusing on. Maybe it's just hard at the end of the day to go out and, on top of everything, focus on the student loans. I don't know.
Harry Reid now comes out with the Student Loan Affordability Act. Well, he's pushing this act, Student Loan Affordability Act. But really, when you take a look at that act, it doesn't really even do anything for students. Maybe if it succeeds, you're talking about something in the next 2 years. Isn't the real problem here that, these are people that are going to school, they have high ambition, they have aspirations, they have dreams to really accomplish something great. And in the end, these students that are coming through right now, if you look at everybody who's analyzed this from the standpoint of what is the impact on a student's ability to move through the economy, they're coming in a low job economy, the jobs are low paying, and their ability to move even with all that ambition it's almost like they are in shackles from the day that they graduate. I don't know that this Student Loan Affordability Act is going to change any of that. What's your take?
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't know that it is. And you have a situation where even if you make slight adjustments to kind of the status quo on student loans, if you're graduating with slightly less debt than you otherwise would into a situation where you might have master's or PhD level people applying for entry-level jobs that 10 years ago, they were really jobs for people with no college degree. Long term, you're not going to be, the idea of the American dream of pulling yourself up is going to be made much more difficult if you have the weight of the student loans and the interest that grows every year that you have to defer starting to repay those. It's going to be very difficult to really live that so-called American dream and pull yourself up.
Just a point of interest, I saw that J.P. Morgan is one of the companies that now has a company put together to collect money from students who are defaulting on loans, and they're making a ton of money by doing that because the interest there alone is enough. I hope as we continue this story, looking at the story, we'll talk about more about Wall Street's interest and how they're directly connected to what's happening here. I know you will, David. David Pakman, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll take a look at the climate criminals that are burning down our planet. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
Tune into Free Speech TV for Democracy Now!, a national, independent, award-winning news program bringing you people and perspectives rarely seen on corporate media.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. The levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere today haven't been this high since dinosaurs roamed the earth. As a result, we've got rapidly accelerating climate change, more disease, and fewer resources. Joining me now to help pinpoint the criminals who are responsible for most of this is author and Ring of Fire co-host Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Bobby, the number 400 would scare the hell out of anybody who understands what's happening with global climate change. Lay the story out for us, would you?
Well, they have now measured the levels of carbon in the atmosphere as being 400 parts per million, and the global consensus among the best scientists in the world was that the you can't go back point would be 350 parts per million. So we've gone to a point where we are virtually guaranteed global rises in temperature that are going to exceed 2 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a level that has not been seen on the planet in many millions of years, 3 to 10 million years, long before human beings evolved. Our oldest ancestors, which were more monkeys than human beings, were 2 million years ago. So human beings have never encountered a temperature rise of this. And you don't have to be a scientist, Pap, to understand that this is happening to us. We saw this week, in fact, there was an article on NPR, a very beautifully researched article about a town called Newton on the coast of Alaska. And it's 400 Inuit people and Nunquit people. And that town is going to have disappeared within 3 years because of global warming. The river on which it sits has terrible storms every year that erode the land underneath this. Now, 90% of the indigenous people in Alaska live on the coast, and almost all of those communities are now endangered. So these are what the NPR story said, America's first environmental refugees, and they talked about the 300 to 400 people who live in this village. But in fact, the Katrina victims were environmental refugees. The people in New York, many of whom ended up staying up in my house with the fires on and candles lit for a month, were environmental refugees. And this week, the New York Times had an extraordinary story that showed that this is a consensus. This is not, a marginal or a kind of radical theory, but that the current revolution in Syria was caused by global warming, by a prolonged drought. So we're seeing environmental refugees, we're seeing political instability all over the world, and it's only the beginning. And all of this is happening
Bobby,
because of the greed of the oil industry.
Yeah, let me ask you, there's many parts to this. I kind of call it the new, really what it is, it's new criminal conduct. It's almost as if, I love when Naomi Klein said, there are lots of companies that do rotten, awful things to people. They do things where they pay them terrible wages. They do things where they have sweatshops and do really awful things to people. But the truth is, here you're talking about something that can kill the next generation, their planet. It's burning up the planet. So this is a new type of corporate criminal conduct. But nevertheless, we have Tillerson with Exxon saying, you know what, we're going to be able to engineer our way out of this. What's your thought on that?
Well, I think about this every time I go through a metal detector machine at an airport and get my body irradiated or who knows what. You look at just the science of risk analysis and all of these precautions that we're taking so that we don't get hit by another terrorist bomb. And then I watch the TV all week this week and watch these super tornadoes hit the Midwest and wipe out entire communities, make them look like the World Trade Center fell again, and kill Americans. And yet the things that we need to do to avert those risks are very, very clear. And that is that we need a carbon tax. We need to start, reducing the amount of carbon that we produce, and we can do that without disrupting the marketplace. We can do it by using free market mechanisms to encourage and incentivize people to reduce the amount of carbon that they are releasing and to reward entrepreneurs and companies who start installing or buying or using and deploying those kind of technologies. And that's what we ought to be doing, and that will make America stronger. It will make us less dependent on carbon and on foreign fuel, and it will make us look more and more towards supporting ourselves with clean, safe, wholesome, and patriotic energy that's not going to sicken our children and not going to ransom the future of the planet and of other generations, which is...
Bobby, there are parts to this, though, that we don't talk about every day. For example, yes, we have the what I call the wet work criminals, the people that are out there drilling. They're spending. Exxon, I think, said, Rex Tillerson said, they're going to spend $37 billion in the next 10 years, about $100 million a day, continuing to drill for more. They know the cost of it. So you have the people that are actually doing what I call the criminal wet work, but you have the aiders and the betters, don't you, Bobby? You've got the media that is so terrified to really tell this story because they understand that when they do tell this story, that advertiser out there that's spending millions of dollars with their company might not come back. Then we have the politicians who are just getting so much money from the industry that it doesn't surprise us at all when we hear Inhofe make the ridiculous statements that he makes. Now we have the religious right, the dominionists who have become kind of the army for the idea that there is no such thing as climate change, and if there is, that's okay because God meant it to be. There are so many parts to this that we have to understand those parts, don't we?
Well, I did a piece on that for HuffPost last week, and it talked about these new studies that have just come out. One of the reasons that the Republican right is so resistant to the idea of doing anything about climate change is that they believe that it would be offensive to their belief in God, in an apocalyptical God, and a approaching apocalypse that we cannot do anything about, and any efforts that we might make to avert it would be disrespectful towards the Creator. And there actually are a large number of these people. James Watt, of course, famously, who was the Interior Secretary under President Reagan when he was answering questions before a Senate committee in 1986, about why he was giving away all of our public lands, our BLM lands, our other public lands for fire sale prices to the timber companies, the oil companies, the mineral companies. He responded, and a congressman asked him at that time, why are you doing this? Shouldn't we preserve this as trustees for future generations, the way that Teddy Roosevelt said when he set up these systems? And Watt replied, well, I don't know how many future generations we can count on before the Lord returns. And that vision, that apocalyptical vision, has really become one of the mainstays of the Republican Party. But you made another point, Pap, and that point was that even Democratic politicians are on board this boat. And I want to read you two quotes. One of these is from John Kerry, who, of course, is the new Secretary of State, who's an old friend of mine, a really close friend of mine, and who, if anything, was as adamant about averting climate change as Al Gore or any politician that we've ever had. The odd thing is, once these people get into office, something snaps, something changes, something corrupts their integrity. And then they get out and they write a book saying what they ought to have done. But why can't they do it when they're in office? And here's an older quote from John Kerry from 5 years ago. Quote, the next 10 years will determine whether we take the necessary actions to reverse the threat of climate change. And why has the American government declined to take meaningful action? Well, now he's in charge of taking meaningful action, which is his primary thing right now that he ought to be doing, is stopping the XL pipeline, which is going to lock us into the dirtiest oil in the world. It's not going to produce any jobs. It's 35 jobs, according to the State Department, for the United States. 35 jobs. It's going to actually raise the price of oil in this country. Why is that, Pap? The reason is because the oil price, the gas prices that we pay, you and I and American people pay at the pump, are not governed by international market prices for oil. They're governed by limitations on refinery capacity here in the United States. The XL pipeline oil, which is going to go down to Port Arthur and be refined in Port Arthur and Galveston, is destined for Asian markets. But before it goes to Asia, it's going to be refined in refineries in Port Arthur and Galveston that are already refining oil for American markets. So by taking up that space in those refineries, it's going to create limitations for the oil that's being sold to our people. And according to the top economists in the oil field, that pipeline is going to raise oil prices in our country by 7 to 10 cents per gallon on average. Now, I want to read you one other quote, and this is from our president, President Obama. He said, I urge this Congress to pursue a bipartisan market-based solution to climate change. But if Congress won't act soon to protect future generations, I will. I will direct my cabinet to come up with executive actions we can take now and in the future to reduce pollution, prepare our communities for the consequences of climate change, and speed the transition to a more sustainable sources of energy.
Bobby, are you optimistic that this administration is going to do much to really change all of this as far? It looks like a freight train that we can't seem to stop.
Mike, I agree with you. We're on the wrong trajectory right now. The Obama administration is going in the wrong direction. He could, with or without Congress, and this is what he promised to do in his State of the Union, he could kill XL sitting in his Oval Office without ever going to Congress. If he won't do it on this issue, which James Hansen, the top climate scientist in our country, has said this is game over for the climate. If he won't do it on this issue, why is he going to fight for us on any other issue?
Bobby, thanks for joining me. Bobby, of course, is co-host of Ring of Fire. He's a law partner of mine, and he's author of Crimes Against Nature, an excellent book that really does lay bare some very ugly stories.
Hap, I'll see you next week.
After the break, we'll take a look at the corporate ties of the Obama administration. I'm Mike Papantonio, and you're watching Ring of Fire on Free Speech TV. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. When he first came into office, President Obama made it clear that he would end years of corporate influence decision-making that dominated the Bush years. But his actions have shown that he won't be keeping that promise. And I've got attorney Howard Nations with me now to talk about Obama's descent into corporatism right here in America. Howard, the Obama corporate administration, I mean, you're reading it everywhere. I mean, it used to be that just a couple of media outlets, progressive media outlets, would be critical of this president and say, you know, really, enough is enough with this whole corporate thing. You come in as a populist and you leave like just a corporate, one of the guys on Wall Street. What's your take on it?
Well, I think it's best exemplified by the most recent appointment of Secretary of Commerce, Penny Pritzker from the Hyatt board, a billionaire out of Chicago. You know, Pritzker owned Superior Bank, where she pioneered subprime operations that targeted the poor and the working middle-class minorities. She crashed it for $1 billion, which was bailed out by the taxpayers, destroyed the lives of numerous families who lost their savings there, and she has a vile anti-union record. This is the president's choice for Secretary of Commerce. It's pretty depressing, actually.
Well, Tom Wheeler, what is your take on Tom Wheeler, Howard? Isn't it the same kind of deal? This is a guy, he's a mega fundraiser for Obama. He's supposed to be in charge of the FCC, and critically important for the average person out there. And this is a guy making decisions. This guy has a bad history.
Well, Tom Wheeler was Nicholas Johnson, who was the previous chairman of the FCC, described his appointment as bizarre because the ultimate public interest is how the FCC is defined by Congress, that it's supposed to be run for the ultimate public interest. They control the internet, the airways, digital communications. And what does President Obama put in charge? A lobbyist, just like we had in a previous discussion about how the lobbyists go in to run the very agencies where they've lobbied for years. But Wheeler is also a venture capitalist who does business with those people who are doing business with the FCC. And it doesn't bode well for us that he was a member of the President's Advisory Committee on the Intelligence Board, and we know what Obama's policy has been on privacy. So tying that into the FCC doesn't work. It's kind of like Bloomberg appointing Trump to be head of the New York Real Estate Board. It's a classic fox in the hen house.
Yeah, but what you have here, you still have progressives out there. It's almost like suspension of disbelief, isn't it, Howard? I mean, you know, even after Mary Jo White was appointed as SEC chair, you still had progressives going, oh, well, no, that's okay. Well, no, it wasn't okay. Mary Jo White was somebody who was in charge of stopping critical investigations of Wall Street. When the administration should have been investigating for stealing money, Mary Jo White was there to say, no, we're going to shut down the investigations totally. At some point, don't progressives have to say, you know, we get it now, we were lied to, that this guy's great, he's a great stump speech speaker, but when it comes to delivering reality, the two are very different. I mean, at what point do we say, let's admit this?
Well, in defense of the president on Mary Jo White, he had to appoint her to head the SEC because Bernie Madoff was unavailable.
Well, but we're seeing this trail that at some point we have to say it's time to act. You know, here's one problem, Howard. When you have a president in the position that's making these corporatist appointments, we saw the same thing with Bill Clinton, if you recall, his first term. Yeah. We saw huge corporate appointments, and the whole Democratic Party moved right with him. Isn't that just a continuation of what's happening here? We have the Democratic Party that we used to say, these are people that are going to take care of us. They're people that are going to take care of the have-nots, and they're going to make sure we have health, education, that the public welfare is always going to be good. But we can't say that anymore because we have a party that has become just as corporatist as the Republicans when you really start taking a close look at all this.
That's very true, and it's really embarrassing for the Democrats that the corporate, take for example, the Bank of America, the absolute poster child for corporate welfare, and they're getting support completely. Matt Taibbi, for whom I have great respect, I think he's maybe the best investigative journalist out there right now, refers to Bank of America as the de facto ward of state. They are so thoroughly propped up by the Obama administration with the support of the Democrats. Despite all their scandals, the mismanagement, despite all the corruption, the fact of the matter is that Bank of America should have been liquidated, its viable units sold off, so that those units at least could be held accountable and responsive to the local people. But they're falling into this too big to fail, and the too big to fail is supported completely by the progressives, unfortunately, as well as the leadership of Obama.
Well, when we take a look, if you go section by section, whether it's the energy companies that have corporations telling Americans what to do because of the appointments by Obama, or whether it's issues with the military where you have corporations in charge of what's happening in America, the theme continues. It's not getting any better, Howard. It's getting worse. I appreciate you joining me on this story. It's an important story, and hopefully it's one that we'll start being realistic about. Thanks for joining me, Howard.
My pleasure. Thanks, Mike.
Part of Obama's corporatist problem is that he appointed an attorney general who's completely in the pocket of big business. And with all the recent scandals surrounding the Department of Justice, it's time for President Obama to finally dump Eric Holder. Do it now. Joining me now to talk about Eric Holder's horrible record is attorney Seth Katz. Seth, it doesn't look like this is a president that has an AG, where the AG is going to be remembered as a Robert F. Kennedy or a Ramsey Clark. It's more likely that this AG is going to be remembered as an Alberto Gonzalez or an Edward Meese, or even worse, a John Ashcroft. What is it that this president allows Holder just to continue the conduct that really is looking pretty ugly here?
You know, I don't know what the cause of it is, Mike, but I think you're right. I mean, civil rights and human rights is certainly not Mr. Holder's specialty. I mean, when you look at what he's been doing and look at what he's allowed under his reign, to have people that are spying on U.S. citizens in the United States just to see what we're talking about, to go through our emails, it's unprecedented.
Well, you know, Seth, we hear about it in this AP scandal, but the truth is we learned that it was going on where you had the DOJ that was infiltrating the Occupy movement. We saw that the Department of Justice was infiltrating environmental activist movement that were complaining about the Obama administration not acting on climate change, and the Obama administration not doing enough about greenhouse gases. We had the Department of Justice actively going out and targeting these people. And you go, what? Doesn't that sound an awful lot like the Nixon days or worse?
Or worse, Pap. It's true. But when you look back at Eric Holder's resume before he became AG, and you look at his days at Covington and Burling, when he himself was the partner representing Chiquita Banana, when they were accused and charged with the count of financing terrorism, and he got them a sweetheart plea deal, you know, that is the man we're dealing with.
So he comes in with a mindset that certainly is not a populist mindset, Seth. It is a corporatist mindset. And if you take a look at it, this administration under Eric Holder, they've charged 6 whistleblowers under the 1917 espionage. That's more than every administration before him. I mean, combined. If you take every administration and combine it, this administration has charged more whistleblowers under that 1917 Act than any other administration. You also take a look at them targeting whistleblowers, prosecuting whistleblowers, and then letting the people that were uncovered in the whistleblowing story, that they move on without any kind of criminal sanctions. The Gitmo story is a great one, isn't it?
Going back to the Whistleblower Act of 1917, Mike, it's amazing because those prosecutions can have nothing but a chilling effect on other people being willing to come forward and engage in the whistleblowing conduct that the laws are designed to prevent or to protect. I mean, the Whistleblower Act that we've got protects whistleblowers. It gives them incentive to come forward. If you look at key TAM actions, where people are supposed to come forward and protect the United States from fraud or detect and deter fraud, these prosecutions against these 6 whistleblowers will have long-standing ramifications as long as this AG is in place, and potentially through the rest of this administration, unless there's a mindset and a sea change in that mindset.
I don't think there's going to be. We heard Obama just this week again coming to the defense of Eric Holder, saying no, he hadn't done anything wrong. But this is an Eric Holder in the Department of Justice that prosecuted the whistleblower who uncovered criminal activity at Gitmo. Now, rather than going after the people who committed the criminal activity at Gitmo, those people got promotions. They weren't prosecuted, and the guy that came forward with the story was prosecuted and actually spent time in jail. Add to that the contrast with this Department of Justice, with this administration. Nobody prosecuted from Wall Street, stole $18 trillion from the American public, no indictments issued, no special grand juries are had on any of this, no stories about wiretapping those folks on Wall Street like they did the AP reporters. But it just seems like it's so lopsided one way that I don't know how this Obama administration comes out of this and says, you know, I really am a president that is for the people. He is anything but for the people, if you look at this history.
You know, and Mike, he uses the buzzword terrorist. You know, we're spying on people we believe to be terrorists. We're doing it for national security. And when you look at this president and what he's done, you know, clearly during the election process, he had to show people that he could be strong on terrorism. But I think a lot of the people that supported him were hoping that he would go back and really worry about the people, worry about America, put America first, put America back to work, focus on making sure that human rights and civil rights were abided by and put at the top of the list.
Seth, but that he was the guy on if you remember, on the speech stump that was talking about how bad the Bush administration was with FISA. This is a president who has extended the laws in the wrath of FISA, hasn't he?
He has. And you know, the thing about FISA, there's no standard. The AG just comes in and says, well, we need this information, and the lawsuit goes away. It's incredible the way it's been treated. But you're right. He voted for FISA when he was a senator. And now the newest incarnation, he's clearly taking or allowing his attorney general to take advantage of.
To expand it even more. Seth, thank you for joining me.
It's been my pleasure as always, Mike.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.
You're witness to a political coup taking place right in front of your damn eyes. That caliber of evil needed to be held accountable in courtrooms. Billionaire mad money wasn't enough to buy democracy. Legislators don't have enough sense to think for themselves. They let Alec do it.
Here at Ring of Fire, the truth is our only agenda, so we're able to bring you the stories that mainstream media just ignored or completely got wrong.